In the late summer of 1943, few men in the Allied world were more famous or more controversial than George S. Patton. His reputation had been forged in North Africa and strengthened during the invasion of Sicily. To his soldiers, he was a warrior from another age, aggressive, theatrical, fearless. He believed war should be fought fast and brutally, and he expected the same ruthless determination from every man under his command. But in Sicily, that same intensity exploded into one of the most embarrassing scandals of the war. The incident began quietly inside a military hospital near the front lines. Exhausted soldiers were being treated for what doctors then called battle fatigue, a condition we now understand as combat trauma. When Patton walked through the ward, he expected to see wounded heroes. Instead, he saw a soldier sitting on a bed with no visible injuries. Furious, Patton demanded to know why the man wasn't fighting. The soldier explained that he simply couldn't take the shelling anymore. To Patton, that sounded like cowardice. In a burst of rage, he slapped the soldier and shouted that men like him were destroying the army. Unfortunately for Patton, it didn't happen just once. Days later, at another hospital, a similar confrontation took place. Again, Patton struck a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. Word of the incident spread quickly through the medical staff and eventually up the chain of command. When the reports reached the desk of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander faced a dilemma that could not have been more difficult. Eisenhower knew Patton better than most. He understood that beneath the explosive temper was one of the most aggressive and talented battlefield commanders the United States possessed. Patton had a rare ability to move armies with incredible speed. He could inspire fear in the enemy and confidence in his own troops. But the hospital incidents had created a political storm. If the story reached the American public, it could damage morale and embarrass the entire Allied command. Eisenhower made a decision that would haunt him for months. Patton would remain in command for the remainder of the Sicily campaign, but afterward he would be quietly removed from frontline leadership. No formal court-martial, no public disgrace. Instead, a silent punishment. Patton would be sidelined while other generals prepared for the next major phase of the war. For Patton, the punishment was unbearable. War was the center of his life. He believed he had been born to command armies in battle, and now the war seemed to be moving forward without him. While other commanders prepared for the coming invasion of Western Europe, Patton found himself trapped in a strange limbo, technically still a general, but without a real army to lead. What made the situation even more painful was the knowledge that a massive invasion was being planned across the English Channel. Everyone in the Allied High Command knew that sooner or later they would have to return to the European continent. The question was not if, but where and when. Planning meetings stretched late into the night. Maps covered entire walls. Every coastline from Norway to southern France was studied in detail. But there was one coastline that fascinated German intelligence more than any other: the narrow stretch of water between England and France at Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest distance across the Channel and the most logical place for an invasion. And in the mind of German planners, one detail made the scenario even more obvious. If the Allies were going to launch their greatest attack of the war, they would surely give command of the invasion force to their most aggressive general. That meant Patton. Inside German intelligence reports, his name appeared again and again. German analysts studied his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. They read translated speeches, analyzed his tactics, and came to a clear conclusion. If Patton appeared somewhere, that place was where the real battle would begin. Ironically, while German intelligence feared him, Patton himself had no idea that his reputation was becoming one of the most valuable weapons the Allies possessed. Meanwhile, in London, Allied leaders were wrestling with an entirely different problem. The coming invasion, what would eventually be known as D-Day, would require absolute surprise. If the Germans concentrated their forces at the landing beaches, the invasion could collapse within hours. Tens of thousands of soldiers might die before even reaching the shore. So the Allies began asking a dangerous question. What if the Germans could be convinced that the invasion was going to happen somewhere else? The idea of deception was not new. Armies had used trickery for centuries, but the scale being discussed now was unprecedented. Entire armies might have to be invented, radio traffic might have to be faked, false intelligence might have to be fed directly into the German spy network. At some point during these discussions, an unusual idea began circulating among British planners. What if the Allies could create a completely fictional army in southeast England, an army that appeared ready to invade at Pas-de-Calais? Such an illusion would require something extremely convincing. It would require a commander the Germans already believed in. And that commander, almost everyone realized at the same time, could only be Patton. According to several accounts from the planning meetings, the suggestion immediately caught the attention of Winston Churchill. Churchill had always been fascinated by unconventional warfare. Throughout the war, he had supported strange and daring ideas, from commandos to secret intelligence networks. The concept of using Patton's reputation as a weapon appealed to him instantly. Instead of leading the real invasion, Patton would lead something far stranger. He would command an army that didn't actually exist. From the outside, it would look enormous. Trucks would move along the roads, radio messages would fill the air, reconnaissance aircraft would spot what appeared to be rows of tanks and aircraft preparing for an assault on Calais. But most of it would be fake. Inflatable tanks, wooden airplanes, carefully staged movements designed to be seen by German spies. The illusion would become known as Operation Fortitude, one of the most ambitious deception operations in military history. But before the plan could move forward, there was one enormous question. How would Patton react? For months, he had been waiting impatiently for a chance to return to combat. His pride had been wounded by the Sicily scandal. His reputation had been questioned. Now, the war's most important operation was approaching, and instead of offering him command of the invasion, Allied leaders were about to ask him to play a role that many soldiers might consider humiliating. He would not be attacking the enemy. He would be pretending to attack the enemy. When Patton first heard the proposal, those present later remembered the disbelief on his face. For a man whose entire identity revolved around aggressive battlefield command, the idea sounded almost absurd. He listened carefully as the details were explained: the fake army, the radio deception, the goal of convincing the Germans that the main invasion would strike Calais instead of Normandy. Finally, Patton asked the question that captured the moment perfectly. "You want me to do what?" For several seconds, the room reportedly fell silent. Then the explanation continued. His reputation, they told him, was exactly what made the plan possible. The Germans already believed he was the Allies' most dangerous general. If they saw him commanding forces in southeast England, they would assume that was where the real invasion would come. In other words, Patton's greatest strength, his fearsome reputation, would become the centerpiece of the greatest deception of the war. For a moment, Patton considered the idea. He would not storm the beaches. He would not lead the first wave into battle. Instead, his job would be something far more subtle: to convince the enemy that an army was waiting to strike where no army actually existed. It was not the role he had dreamed of, but as the implications became clear, even Patton had to admit something remarkable. If the deception worked, it might save thousands of Allied soldiers when the real invasion finally began. By the beginning of 1944, the Allied command understood that victory in Western Europe depended on one fragile advantage: surprise. The success of the coming invasion would rely not only on ships, aircraft, and soldiers, but on whether the German High Command could be convinced to look in the wrong direction at the most critical moment. If Germany concentrated its armored divisions at the real landing beaches, the invasion might collapse within hours. Entire divisions could be pushed back into the sea before they ever established a foothold in France. The solution the Allies began constructing was so unusual that it almost sounded like fiction. Instead of hiding their invasion force, they would build a second army, an army designed to be seen. This force would appear massive, active, and ready to strike across the narrowest part of the English Channel. German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph it. German spies would report on it. Radio intercept stations would hear its communications day and night. The name of this force was the First U.S. Army Group, often shortened to FUSAG. On paper, it looked enormous. Intelligence reports suggested it contained dozens of divisions, thousands of vehicles, and a powerful air support structure. Its supposed headquarters was located in southeast England, the exact area that faced the French coastline at Pas-de-Calais. From a strategic perspective, everything about the location made sense. The distance across the water was shorter than anywhere else along the channel. Supply lines would be easier. Reinforcements could cross more quickly. To German planners studying their maps in Berlin, the picture seemed obvious. If the Allies were preparing their main invasion of Europe, Pas-de-Calais was the logical target. And if the invasion was going to be launched there, then the commander of that army would have to be the aggressive American general they feared the most, George S. Patton. What the Germans did not realize was that the army they were watching was almost entirely an illusion. In fields across southeast England, strange objects began appearing. At first glance, they looked like armored vehicles parked in neat rows. But up close, they were nothing more than carefully constructed rubber inflatables. Engineers could pack them into small containers, inflate them in minutes, and create the silhouette of a tank that looked convincing from the air. Wooden frames covered in canvas were shaped to resemble aircraft parked on improvised airfields. Fake supply depots appeared almost overnight, filled with empty crates and staged equipment. The deception extended far beyond simple props. Allied planners knew that German intelligence relied heavily on radio interception. Signal units across Britain began generating constant streams of fake communications, carefully imitating the patterns that a large army would produce. Messages discussed training exercises, supply shortages, vehicle movements, and operational planning. To German analysts listening from across the channel, it sounded exactly like a massive army preparing for war. Behind this enormous deception effort stood a small but extremely specialized Allied organization known as the London Controlling Section. Its job was to coordinate every piece of misinformation being sent toward the Germans. The planners understood that deception only worked if every detail supported the illusion. A fake army could not simply exist on paper. It had to behave like a real one. Trucks drove back and forth along certain roads to create the appearance of constant activity. Construction crews built dummy camps visible from the air. Soldiers were occasionally sent into nearby towns wearing unit patches associated with divisions that technically didn't exist. Even casual conversations overheard in pubs were sometimes carefully staged. But the most important element of the illusion was still missing. An army, even a fake one, needed a commander. And that commander had to be believable enough to convince the German High Command that the force was real. That was where Patton entered the story. After the controversy following the Sicily campaign, Patton had been kept away from major combat operations. To many observers, it looked like he had been quietly pushed aside by the Allied leadership. But now that apparent punishment became part of the deception itself. When Patton was suddenly assigned to command the First U.S. Army Group, German intelligence immediately took notice. For them, the message seemed obvious. The Allies were preparing their most aggressive general for the most important invasion of the war. Patton understood that his role in the operation was unusual. Instead of leading troops into battle, he was now performing a kind of strategic theater. His job was to be visible enough that German spies would notice him. He inspected units, traveled between bases, and appeared frequently in the regions where the Phantom Army was supposedly preparing for the assault on Calais. German reconnaissance aircraft occasionally flew over southern England, photographing what they believed were vast concentrations of Allied equipment. When intelligence officers analyzed the photographs, they saw rows of tanks, clusters of aircraft, and busy supply depots. Combined with intercepted radio traffic and spy reports, the evidence seemed overwhelming. From the German perspective, everything pointed to one conclusion: the main Allied invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. What made the deception even more convincing was the use of double agents operating inside Britain. Some of the spies working for Germany had actually been captured by British intelligence early in the war. Instead of being imprisoned, they were secretly turned into double agents and began feeding carefully crafted misinformation back to their German handlers. Among the most important of these agents was a network that consistently reported on the buildup of forces in southeast England. Their messages described massive troop concentrations and repeated preparations for an invasion across the shortest point of the Channel. Because these agents had previously provided accurate information, German intelligence trusted them completely. Every report reinforced the illusion. A new armored division arriving near Dover, additional landing craft appearing in nearby ports, Patton personally inspecting training exercises along the coast. All of it seemed to confirm that the Allies were preparing their most powerful army for a direct strike against Calais. Meanwhile, the real invasion force was being assembled hundreds of miles away, in areas of southern England that were far less visible to German reconnaissance. The soldiers training for the actual landings in Normandy practiced endlessly on beaches and in mock villages. Their commanders understood that secrecy was their greatest weapon. But secrecy alone was not enough. The Germans had to believe something else. They had to believe in the Phantom Army. Inside the Allied command structure, the tension surrounding the deception grew stronger with every passing week. If the Germans ever realized that the First U.S. Army Group was fake, the entire strategy could collapse. Panzer divisions might be moved towards Normandy before the invasion even began. And if that happened, the consequences could be catastrophic. So the illusion continued to grow. More inflatable tanks appeared across the countryside. More radio messages filled the air. More intelligence reports were quietly delivered to German agents. At the center of it all stood Patton, the general who had spent his career preparing to fight the enemy head-on. Now he was performing a kind of...
By the spring of 1944, the deception surrounding the Phantom invasion force had grown so convincing that German intelligence was beginning to treat it as fact rather than speculation. Reports arriving in Berlin painted a clear and seemingly logical picture. Across southeastern England, an enormous Allied army was preparing for a massive assault against the French coast at Pas-de-Calais. The buildup appeared steady and deliberate. Equipment was being assembled. Radio traffic suggested constant planning. Reconnaissance photographs showed long rows of vehicles and aircraft. To the analysts studying these reports inside the German High Command, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Allies were preparing to strike at the narrowest point of the English Channel. At the center of this belief was one familiar name: George S. Patton. German intelligence had been watching Patton closely for years. They considered him one of the most aggressive commanders in the Allied arsenal. His rapid advances in North Africa and Sicily had demonstrated a style of warfare that the Germans both respected and feared. In their eyes, Patton was exactly the kind of general who would lead the main Allied assault on Western Europe. So when intelligence reports began confirming that Patton had been placed in command of a large force in southeastern England, it seemed to confirm everything German planners already suspected. Across the English Channel, German reconnaissance aircraft continued flying missions over Britain whenever weather conditions allowed. Pilots photographed what appeared to be enormous camps, supply depots, and concentrations of vehicles. Analysts examining the photographs identified rows of tanks, artillery positions, and airfields filled with aircraft. From the air, everything looked authentic. What the pilots could not see was how fragile the illusion really was. Many of the tanks were inflatable. Entire airfields were built from wooden frames covered in canvas. Vehicles were moved carefully from one location to another to create the appearance of constant activity. The deception was designed specifically for distant observation, where small details disappeared and shapes alone told the story. Meanwhile, Allied radio operators continued generating a constant stream of messages that simulated the communication patterns of a massive army. German signals intelligence intercepted these transmissions daily. Analysts studied the call signs, message frequencies, and coded references to unit movements. Everything matched the expected behavior of a large military formation preparing for a major offensive. But perhaps the most convincing element of the deception came from the German spy network operating in Britain. Early in the war, British counterintelligence had quietly captured several German agents who had been sent into the country. Instead of executing them or imprisoning them for the rest of the conflict, British intelligence made a bold decision. The captured spies would be turned into double agents and allowed to continue communicating with their German handlers. Over time, these agents developed a reputation for reliability. They occasionally sent genuine information, small details that would later prove accurate. This careful balance made their reports extremely valuable in the eyes of German intelligence. Now, those same agents were feeding Berlin a steady stream of misinformation. Their reports described enormous Allied troop concentrations in southeastern England. They spoke of divisions arriving one after another, equipment piling up in staging areas, and constant training exercises for an amphibious assault across the Channel. They confirmed that Patton himself had been seen inspecting units and overseeing preparations for an invasion across the Channel. For German analysts trying to piece together the Allied strategy, the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple intelligence sources all pointed toward the same conclusion: the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Inside the German leadership, these reports began influencing major strategic decisions. Defensive positions along the French coast were already being strengthened, but now the focus shifted heavily towards the Calais region. Additional artillery was deployed, infantry units reinforced coastal defenses. Most importantly, powerful armored divisions were positioned nearby, ready to counterattack the moment the invasion began. At the highest level of German command, the information was being reviewed by Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler had long believed that the most logical invasion point for the Allies would be Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest crossing from England to France and the easiest location for Allied supply lines. The intelligence reports appearing on his desk seemed to confirm his strategic instincts perfectly. The presence of Patton only reinforced the conclusion. Hitler considered Patton the Allies' most aggressive field commander. If the Allies intended to break into Europe with overwhelming force, they would surely place him at the center of the operation. Reports describing Patton's command of a massive army in southeastern England seemed like undeniable proof that the main invasion was being prepared exactly where Hitler expected it. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Allied planners continued preparing for the real operation. The actual landing zones had been chosen along the coast of Normandy, a region that appeared less obvious as an invasion site. The beaches were farther from England, and the terrain behind them was complicated. But the area also offered a critical advantage. German defenses there were weaker than those around Calais. The entire Allied strategy depended on one fragile assumption. If the Germans could be convinced that the main invasion would strike at Calais, they might hesitate to move their strongest forces towards Normandy even after the landings began. Inside Allied headquarters, commanders understood that the deception had reached a dangerous stage. The illusion had been successful so far, but the real test was still approaching. Once the invasion started, the Germans would quickly realize that something was happening along the Normandy coast. The question was what they would do next. If German commanders immediately shifted their armored divisions towards Normandy, the Allied beachheads might be crushed before reinforcements could arrive. But if they believed Normandy was only a diversion, a preliminary attack meant to distract them from the real invasion at Calais, they might hesitate to their response. Those delays could mean the difference between success and disaster. So the deception surrounding the Phantom Army continued without interruption. Radio traffic remained heavy. Fake equipment continued appearing in reconnaissance photographs. Double agents kept sending reassuring reports back to Berlin. Everything was designed to reinforce one central idea. The real invasion had not yet begun. In German intelligence offices, analysts continued studying every new piece of information. Their maps of southeastern England were filled with markings showing troop concentrations and supply depots. Arrows pointed across the channel towards Pas-de-Calais. In their view, the pattern of preparation was unmistakable. They believed they understood the Allied plan, and because they believed they understood it, they felt confident they could defeat it. What they didn't realize was that the most important battle of the war had already begun. Not on the beaches of France, but inside the minds of the German commanders themselves. Every intercepted radio signal, every spy report, every reconnaissance photograph was slowly shaping their expectations. The deception was working exactly as Allied planners had hoped. When the invasion finally came, German leaders would be watching the wrong coastline, and the army they feared most would be waiting exactly where they expected it to be, across the channel, preparing for an attack that would never come. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe finally began. Across the English Channel, thousands of Allied ships moved silently through the dark waters toward the coast of Normandy. Inside the landing craft, soldiers waited in tense silence, gripping their rifles while waves slammed against the metal hulls. Above them, hundreds of aircraft crossed the night sky, carrying airborne divisions whose mission was to land behind enemy lines and secure critical roads and bridges. This was the moment the Allies had been preparing for years: D-Day. For the soldiers heading toward the beaches, the plan was simple but terrifying. They had to land on heavily defended shores, break through German fortifications, and push inland before the enemy could organize a massive counterattack. If German armored divisions arrived too quickly, the invasion might collapse before it ever gained momentum. But across the channel, inside German headquarters, confusion was already beginning to spread. Shortly after midnight, the first reports started arriving from France. Radar stations along the Normandy coast detected unusual air activity. Paratroopers were dropping behind German lines. Small groups of Allied soldiers were appearing near bridges and crossroads. At first, many German officers assumed these were isolated commando operations designed to disrupt communications. Then, as dawn approached, the scale of the attack became impossible to ignore. Coastal observers began reporting large numbers of ships approaching the Normandy shoreline. Soon, artillery positions along the coast were opening fire on the incoming armada.
Explosions echoed along the beaches as Allied warships bombarded German defenses in preparation for the landings. By early morning, the message was clear. An invasion was underway. Yet, even at that moment, uncertainty remained at the highest levels of German command. Many officers believed that the landings in Normandy were not the main attack. Instead, they suspected the Allies were launching a diversion, an attempt to draw German forces away from the real invasion that would soon strike somewhere else. That belief had been carefully planted by months of deception. For weeks, German intelligence had been convinced that the primary Allied invasion force was gathering in southeastern England under the command of George S. Patton. The phantom army of the First U.S. Army Group had been observed repeatedly through reconnaissance photographs, intercepted radio traffic, and spy reports. All of that information pointed toward one conclusion: the real invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. Now, as fighting erupted along the beaches of Normandy, many German commanders hesitated. They asked a simple question: was this the real invasion or just the beginning of something larger? At German headquarters in France, several officers argued that the landings in Normandy were merely a distraction. They believed the Allies were trying to force Germany to move its reserves away from the Calais region. If German armored divisions rushed toward Normandy too quickly, they might leave the real invasion point dangerously exposed. The decision was ultimately influenced by the man whose instincts shaped so many German strategies: Adolf Hitler. Hitler had long believed that Pas-de-Calais was the most logical location for the Allied invasion. The intelligence reports describing Patton's supposed army there had reinforced that belief. Even as reports from Normandy described large-scale fighting, Hitler remained convinced that the main Allied assault had not yet begun. Because of this belief, some of Germany's most powerful armored divisions were not immediately sent toward Normandy. Instead, they waited. They waited for confirmation that the Normandy landings were truly the main attack. Meanwhile, the battle on the beaches was becoming one of the most intense moments of the entire war. Along stretches of coastline with names like Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, Allied soldiers fought desperately to establish a foothold. German machine guns fired from bunkers overlooking the sand. Artillery shells exploded among the landing craft. In some sectors, waves of soldiers were cut down before they could even reach cover. The fighting was especially brutal on Omaha Beach, where American troops faced steep cliffs and heavily fortified German positions. For several terrifying hours, the situation looked dangerously close to failure. Units became disorganized under heavy fire, and casualties mounted rapidly. But slowly, small groups of soldiers began finding ways through the defenses. Engineers cleared obstacles, infantrymen climbed cliffs and attacked bunkers from unexpected angles. Naval gunfire pounded German strongpoints. By midday, the first fragile beachheads were beginning to take shape. At that critical moment, the German High Command still hesitated to release all of its reserves. Many officers believed that committing their armored divisions too early might play directly into the Allied plan. If the real invasion came at Calais, they would need those forces to stop it. This hesitation was exactly what the Allied deception planners had hoped for. The illusion created by Operation Fortitude was still influencing German decisions, even as the invasion was unfolding. Intelligence reports continued suggesting that Patton's massive army remained in southeastern England, preparing for its own assault across the Channel. From the German perspective, the logic seemed convincing. Why would the Allies use their most aggressive commander for a secondary operation? Surely Patton would lead the real invasion. And since Patton had not appeared in Normandy, many German leaders believed the decisive attack had not yet begun. So the armored divisions near Pas-de-Calais stayed in place. Days passed, then more days. Even as Allied troops pushed farther inland from the Normandy beaches, German commanders remained cautious about shifting too many forces away from Calais. the Phantom Army still appeared to be preparing for an invasion. Radio traffic continued. Reconnaissance flights still reported suspicious activity. In reality, the army they feared did not exist, but its shadow continued shaping the battlefield. Those lost days became some of the most important hours of the entire war. During that time, the Allies poured reinforcements across the Channel. More soldiers landed on the beaches, supplies arrived, air support intensified. What had begun as a fragile foothold slowly grew into a powerful Allied position in northern France. By the time the German High Command finally realized that Normandy was the main invasion, it was already too late. The beachheads were secure. The deception had worked. And somewhere across the Channel, the general whose reputation had helped create the illusion continued playing his role, allowing the Germans to believe just a little longer that the real attack was still waiting to come.
For nearly 2 weeks after the landings in Normandy began, German commanders remained trapped inside a dangerous illusion. Reports from the front clearly showed that Allied forces were expanding their foothold in France. More troops were arriving every day. Ports along the English Channel were filled with transport ships moving soldiers, tanks, and supplies toward the growing battlefield. Yet even as the fighting intensified, many leaders within the German command structure still believed something far larger was coming. The invasion in Normandy, they argued, was only the beginning. According to the intelligence they had trusted for months, the real blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais. That belief had been reinforced by countless reports describing the massive army supposedly waiting in southeastern England under the command of George S. Patton. In German planning documents, that force, the First U.S. Army Group, was still considered the main Allied striking power. From their perspective, the logic seemed clear. Normandy was a diversion designed to draw German defenses away from Calais. Once the Germans committed their reserves to the battle in Normandy, the true invasion would launch across the narrowest part of the Channel, led by Patton himself. Because of that belief, some of Germany's most powerful divisions remained stationed near Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. Meanwhile, along the Normandy front, Allied forces were gaining strength with every passing day. After the brutal fighting of the first landings, engineers quickly began building temporary harbors known as mulberries, massive artificial structures designed to allow ships to unload supplies directly onto the beaches. Within days, thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and tanks were being brought ashore. Allied aircraft dominated the skies above northern France, making it extremely difficult for German reinforcements to move during daylight. Railways were bombed, bridges were destroyed, roads became dangerous corridors constantly watched by Allied fighter bombers. Every hour that passed allowed the Allies to grow stronger. But the deception surrounding the Phantom Army continued doing its work. German intelligence kept receiving signals that seemed to confirm the existence of a massive invasion force still waiting in England. Radio traffic suggested that large units remained in position. Reports from agents continued describing preparations for an assault across the Channel toward Calais. Even aerial reconnaissance seemed to show activity in the same staging areas that had been monitored for months. The illusion had become so powerful that it continued shaping German strategy even after the invasion had clearly begun elsewhere. Inside Allied headquarters, commanders watched this situation with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had hoped the deception would delay German reactions, but few had imagined it would be this successful. The fact that major armored divisions were still being held back near Calais meant that the Normandy beachheads faced far less resistance than they might have otherwise encountered. Those 2 weeks were priceless. During that time, the fragile Allied foothold in Normandy transformed into a massive military presence. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed the Channel. Supply lines became stronger. Defensive positions were expanded. What had begun as a risky amphibious landing was quickly turning into the largest Allied army ever assembled in Western Europe. Eventually, reality began forcing its way into German strategic discussions.
Reports from the front made it impossible to deny the scale of the Normandy operation. Allied forces were not withdrawing, they were advancing. Their supply flow showed no signs of slowing. Every day the beachhead grew larger. Gradually, German commanders began to accept the truth. Normandy had been the real invasion all along. The army they had been waiting for at Calais did not exist. By the time this realization fully set in, the opportunity to crush the invasion had already slipped away. The delay in moving armored divisions had given the Allies exactly what they needed: time. Time to reinforce the beaches, time to establish supply routes, time to prepare for the next phase of the campaign. Soon the Allied armies would break out of Normandy and begin their advance across France. Looking back on the operation, historians would later describe the deception plan known as Operation Fortitude as one of the most successful strategic illusions ever created in warfare. It had combined intelligence operations, fake equipment, double agents, and carefully staged movements to convince an entire enemy command structure of something that simply wasn't real. And at the center of that illusion stood Patton. For a man who had built his entire career on aggressive battlefield leadership, his role in this operation had been deeply unusual. While the most important invasion of the war unfolded in Normandy, Patton had remained in England, commanding an army that existed largely on paper. To outside observers, it might have looked like he had been sidelined or forgotten. But in reality, his reputation had been one of the most powerful weapons the Allies possessed. The Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied general. That fear made the deception believable. If Patton appeared to be preparing an invasion at Calais, German planners naturally assumed that must be where the decisive battle would occur. In a strange twist of history, one of Patton's greatest contributions to the war came during a period when he was not fighting at all. Eventually, once the Normandy campaign had stabilized and the deception was no longer necessary, Patton would return to the battlefield with real armies under his command. Later in 1944, Patton would lead the U.S. Third Army in one of the most rapid advances of the entire war, driving across France with the speed and aggression that had made him famous. But the events surrounding the Normandy invasion left behind a powerful lesson about warfare. Victory is not always decided by firepower alone. Sometimes it is decided by what the enemy believes. In this case, an entire German defensive strategy had been shaped by a carefully constructed illusion. Inflatable tanks, fake radio messages, and a phantom army had held powerful divisions in place, while the real invasion secured its foothold in France. And because of that deception, thousands of Allied soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy were able to survive the most dangerous hours of the operation. The enemy had been watching the wrong coastline, and the general they feared most had helped them convince to keep looking there.